This podcast is about correcting the balance, whether it's something celebrated as good when it shouldn't be, or the other way around. Or maybe the heroic tales of history just need to be knocked straight on their ass. Me, I just want to share the complete picture, because that's when this whole thing gets fun. Warning, jokes and sarcasm may ensue. Welcome to Prick the Balloon. Hi, I'm Mike Vance, and welcome to episode 17 of Prick the Balloon, which means my podcast is almost old enough to have sex. They grow up so fast. Of course, in Louisiana, we passed that milestone episodes ago, so laissez le bon temps rouler. We are back to full-length episodes after a couple of PTB quickies that I scheduled in advance while I was on vacation. We got to enjoy 16 fantastic days in Argentina, with day trips into Uruguay and Brazil, and I will warn you up front, this is going to start out as a bit of a travelogue, often the opposite of Mark Twain's, but we're headed toward history, I promise. First, some random facts and observations. Argentinian women are beautiful, but more than a few of them do not hesitate to pick their nose in public. You're never too old to watch foreign language cartoons on a network called Paka Paka. Paka Paka. That includes cartoons about a goth octopus named Ciro Todorov. Restaurants inside crowded food markets are almost always terrific. Everyone talks about Argentinian steaks, but for the most part, ours are better. On the other hand, the Italian food in Buenos Aires absolutely rocks. Maybe the best burrata and carpaccio I have ever had outside of Italy itself, because, Italians make good Italian food. Here's another one. A little girl walking on a park path with her family will always give her mother the stink eye when the park choo-choo passes. Stink eye is the same in all languages. There are an inordinate number of stray dogs in Argentina, and they have learned to navigate the street life, including using crosswalks and mooching food off sidewalk cafe diners just like Chris Christie does. Apartments everywhere have annoying neighbors. We stayed at an Airbnb for the first 6 days, and the woman immediately above our flat was a fantastic classical pianist, so we got a free concert twice a day, and we're thinking, great. Unfortunately, she also had a screaming baby, and a toddler who woke up at 4 a.m. to practice for a Sasquatch pageant. In Buenos Aires, vehicles have little round number discs on the back that tell cops the maximum speed they're allowed to go. It's a big round number decal declaring to the world that you are driving a total piece of shit. If the speed limit is 120 kilometers an hour, but you have a disc that says 110 or 100, that's as fast as you're allowed to go, because the government thinks your minivan is going to blow apart like a fake Republican elector on a witness stand. If your disc says 80, people just point and laugh. Below that, it's like my longtime comedian buddy Tracy Wright's old bit, that his car was such a piece of shit, he'd get passed by weather. Finally, I loved some of the dog walkers near the parks in Palermo neighborhood of Buenos Aires. Like 20 dogs at once. It looked like a freaking New Yorker cartoon. It was beautiful. So what all did we do? We went to a lot of markets, including one outside Recoleta Cemetery. I bought 3 handmade knit finger puppets for $2 apiece, including a kick-ass llama. Thank you very much. That cemetery has some world-class, decaying 19th century grandeur. It ranks right up there with Paris or New Orleans. Since there were mosquitoes, let's go with New Orleans. That's where Eva Perón is buried, and in Argentina, she is like Elvis, only without the toilet and Demerol. I could have had the mama, too. We explored a good deal of northeastern Argentina, ate a lot of great food, watched bad Argentinian crime movies at night while we drank really good wine, saw hundreds of incredible birds, went to the largest waterfall system in the world at Iguazu, which was running about 4 times normal capacity when we were there thanks to torrential rains. That should be a bucket list item for everyone, but damn, all the water we saw is great for boosting your insignificance quotient. Makes you feel smaller than junior prom during an acne flare-up. There were cool vignettes we walked by on the street. An old guy with his coat draped on his shoulders like Bela Lugosi's cape. sitting at a table by the coffee shop window drawing the same woman in his sketch pad over and over. We passed a happy family, mom, dad, dog, and 3 little girls, walking down the fanciest boulevard in BA, passing the Jaguar dealership and the French ambassador's residence, laughing and tossing a bag of dog poop back and forth among themselves. Aw, Dad. One of my favorite places was the old zoo, which they turned into an eco park. Some of the animals have been sent away, but others are still there. A giraffe, a bison, a hippo, Pablo Escobar. It was overrun with free-range maras, who were a Patagonian hare. I loved them. Loved them. Big-eyed, short-eared, docile jackrabbits who look like they're wearing rain ponchos over their butts. I wanted to bring some home, but I doubt if the neighborhood coyotes would approve. The Eco Park had set up natural-looking screens in some places to hide the people from the animals. Lower the animals' stress, which is great. Otherwise, that giraffe is going to be like, "Hey, why is that bitch in the tank top trying to IG me, bro?" I know those old-style zoos were really sad places for the animals, and I don't want to revert to those tight cages ever, but I will admit I still have a total fascination with old zoos. I collect old postcards, and I love old 1900-era zoo postcards. The Jardín Zoológico in Buenos Aires was fantastic. It was started by a president of Argentina named Domingo Sarmiento. And Sarmiento is another great example of that old thing about people not being black and white. The guy was a writer who believed in European liberalism and American public education. He set up the first real school system in Argentina, modeled after what he had seen in New England. He even imported like 100 teachers from Boston to get it going. He brought in thousands of European immigrants and started the country to focus on building great world cities, which Buenos Aires really is. But he also ran up debt and was generally unpopular with the citizens. And oh yeah, he talked regularly about killing the indigenous Indios, who he called disgusting, and said their extermination, if it happened, would be, quote, sublime and great, end quote. On top of that, environmentalists hate Sarmiento because he introduced sparrows to Argentina, and they crowd out other birds. When we had lunch that day in Uruguay, there was actually a beggar sparrow who tugged on my pant leg asking for breadcrumbs. Of course, by that time, I was out of bread. So I bought the guy a little tiny mojito, and everybody left happy. I am not an astronomer, but I know who Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young are, and we saw the Southern Cross. Or we would have, except for light pollution. But we were using this really cool phone app on a rooftop in Buenos Aires. Don't ask. Okay, I'll tell you. I love trip planning, and for our last 2 nights before we came home, I booked us into a nice boutique hotel. They had a thing called a terrace suite. It's like $30 more, and I figure, it's our last nights, why not? I'm thinking there's a tiny balcony door we can open and look out. No. It's the fucking penthouse of this fantastic 8-story hotel. We had a full, giant terrace, bigger than Oliver and Lisa Douglas. We had our own grill. Now, I am not going to be barbecuing in a hotel room, but I coulda, and that's the point. There was a hot tub, our own private cauldron of disease, all ours for an extra 30 smackers. But the rear window quality of this place was off the charts. You could look into about 80 other apartments. A lady putting out her Hello Kitty laundry, a guy working at his computer, a woman in a super nice wood-paneled kitchen making ceviche, 3 beatniks plotting a coup. Such is the beauty of South America. Ha! I'm kidding. Argentina is a wonderful, vibrant democracy who just happened to elect the right-wing child of Engelbert Humperdinck and Howdy Doody. Oh, one other random Argentina fact. Their toilet paper sheets are twice as big as American toilet paper sheets. Like you search in vain for the little perforated line. But what that means is that the spray-on Twitler cannot ever call Argentina a shithole country. As much as the Orange Goons family are, what's the technical term I'm looking for? Oh yeah, shameless criminal pieces of shit. I have to admit that a few 100 million Americans in general have a tendency to be judgmental about other countries. That was the Mark Twain reference I was making. That's partly because there is so much to see in the U.S. that millions of us never leave, and going on a cruise to the Bahamas or Playa del Carmen, where your giant Hummer of a ship vomits 4,000 other Americans onto the dock at the same time, just doesn't count. If you're never more than 6 paces away from a Lauren Tweez doppelganger leading your group behind a butterfly flag, you might as well have just gone to Barnes & Noble. Now, I'm talking about true international travel, where you deal with normal citizens of other countries. Bonus points if it's a country with vastly different hygiene habits than our own. International communication makes all of us better rounded people. Get outside your comfort zone. Try to see the world. Americans should especially try relying on another language. The number of U.S. citizens who speak another language has tripled in the last 20 years. Almost 1 in 4 Americans can speak a foreign language, although half of those said they don't necessarily do it well. That would be where I come in. But when you eliminate naturalized citizens and their children, that high percentage plummets. Still, if you take everyone together, our diversity makes the United States the 5th most bilingual country in the world. Pretty good. The top 4 are Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Nigeria, and India. Indonesia has like 700 languages, so that one's not very surprising. Lots of other countries have better language courses in school than we have, but our diversity makes us a winner. By the way, the 2 most monolingual countries on Earth, the UK and Ireland. Too bad they don't speak English in those places. For travelers, more and more touristy places in foreign countries speak English, so sometimes you take the time to do lessons or brush up on what you totally forgot from high school, and then you don't even get to practice your skills. The bottom line is these tour guides and even waitresses go to school to learn how to make that a career, and they would much rather use their better English than endure the blackboard scratch and pain of hearing you mangle their language. You know how you complain to your friends when you get a foreign customer service rep who barely squeezed into their phone bank job with a D- in their English course? Guess what? When you travel, that's you. You are Bobby from customer service in Delhi. That's why the barber in Kyoto gave you a shit-ass haircut. He had no freaking idea what you were talking about. Even with Google Translate, you just pointed to the place above your ears and said lizard trousers. So the dude did the best he could. There are almost 342 million Americans as of the minute I am recording this, and after the world tourism industry during COVID collapsed like a Wyoming highway, now the tables have completely turned. Americans are traveling again in drones. So are Europeans. But the biggest new player in spewing forth badly dressed people who refuse to learn any local customs are the Chinese. Our tour guide for 2 days at Iguazu Falls, a Brazilian by nationality, filled us in. Chinese have become the largest group of non-South American visitors, and he said not a single one of them bothers to learn a word of anything other than Chinese. So now, several countries around the world are complaining about too many tourists. Italy, Japan, Spain, and yes, there is a large irony about Japanese complaining about tourists. But big attractions are pitifully overcrowded, and dumbass tourists are now wandering into residential neighborhoods that just aren't used to foreign gawkers wearing black socks and sandals. Tourism aside, I want to talk about how people in other countries view the United States, and that is different than our own oblivious behavior. So what do these people think of us? The U.S. has a long-time habit of telling people what to do. Mostly we feel like we are out there changing the world for the better, but the people in the places we go often have different opinions. They might not want to be changed. Maybe they have a better grasp on unintended consequences. We went to a national park in Argentina on this last trip, one of the most fantastic and cool and remote places I have ever been. It was 126 miles from the regional airport to where we stayed. When we flew in, the driver that picked us up said 6 or 7 hours. Now, he spoke no English whatsoever, so I put that down to me, just missing some kind of nuance. Nope, it took 6.5 hours, 126 miles. When we left there to go back to the airport, we went the short way. That only took 5 hours. The first 4 were on a dirt road that was a numbered national highway, and when I say dirt, I mean mud, at least a foot deep of mud. You jump out of the ruts and you are sitting there until someone else comes along with a tow chain. Oh, did I mention the first half of the 5 hours was in total pitch darkness, dodging the occasional cow and roving packs of capybaras, fishtailing while Jorge, our stoic driver, jumps us back into the rut. When I use the word bone rattling, I mean, a dislocated shoulder, and I may have inadvertently donated a kidney. In the last political campaigns there, provincial politicians promised to pave the road. They even went so far as to move construction equipment into view. When the election was over, they came and picked the shit up. Here's the thing. The allure of the national park is the wildlife. And if the roads were paved, they would soon be littered with bodies of foxes and deer and capybaras, who are cool and chill as shit, by the way, but perhaps not too bright. So, what's really best? Sometimes it's not the American idea of improvement. The answer is not always pavement, or Botox and ass cheek implants for that matter. Nature is always smarter than us. Here's the interesting story of that park, because it fits exactly into what I'm talking about. There was an American couple called Doug and Chris Tompkins. Doug and his first wife, Susie, founded North Face and Esprit and made the proverbial shit ton of cashola. Doug was also an environmentalist and philanthropist. He and Chris had this huge nonprofit called Conservation Land Trust that was particularly interested in southern South America. They bought 2 million acres of temperate rainforest and peaks and lakes in Chile and ultimately donated it to the government in what was the largest private land donation in history, anywhere. They did a similar thing with this gigantic area of wetlands in Corrientes province in northern Argentina, with the help of that horrible scourge George Soros, I might add, who took time out from eating babies to help save the planet a little. That George. The land had been used for rice growing and cattle ranching, and Tompkins bought it cheap because the farms were failing after fires and drought, and then he set out to reintroduce the native species that had been lost. Just like Yellowstone Park, this area, called Ibarra, came back with biodiversity. There are now jaguars and giant anteaters, pampas deer, collared peccaries, and macaws. Now, we didn't see a jaguar or an anteater, but it is still a fantastically wonderful place, and I encourage everyone to brave the shit roads and go there and stay at the place we stayed, which was called Rincon del Socorro, because it is off the charts great. Well, when the Tompkins Group bought up all that land with the plan to donate this incredible national park to Argentina, the biggest one in the country, by the way, the newspaper headlines were, "American buys third largest wetlands in the world to steal all our water." That's what most Argentinians still believe to this day. They don't realize yet that he gave the land to the national government to establish this great park. Because, newspaper retractions are in 6-point font. That part's universal. So do you know why Argentinians jump to the absolute worst conclusion? Largely because Americans have established this MO. For a long time, other countries have looked at us like this outwardly sexy chick who had snapped their fingers at them in public, treated them like dog shit so many times that they finally got tired of going home with us. Unfortunately, the U.S. would call at 2 a.m. after the bars closed and say, "Hey, can I come over for old time's sake?" And the other little country, who was probably a little buzzed, would say, "Okay," even against their better judgment. And then the next morning at noon, the little country wakes up all hungover, drool on their chin, and finds out that the U.S. stole their best T-shirt, left the half and half out on the counter, and let the goddamn cat out. See, here's the thing. The U.S. has invaded a ton of other countries. There are a couple of British historians who wrote a book about their country's record of military intervention. It's called All the Countries We've Ever Invaded and the Few We Never Got Round to. Pretty straightforward. According to them, out of the 193 members of the United Nations, the Brits have invaded 171 of them. And just for shits and giggles, which though often satisfying is still an odd way to amuse yourself, they counted up the same for the United States. according to the two English dudes, we have surpassed them. There are only 3 earthly nations with which the United States have never been militarily involved: Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein. Taken all together, those 3 countries occupied the exact same amount of territory as my garage. Now, military involvement takes many forms. The U.S. invaded France, for example, in 1944. But it was to drive out Hitler and Steve Bannon, so most people think that was a good thing. Old French men came out and kissed all the American soldiers, and then one thing led to another, and Judy Garland sold a shit ton of records. Look it up. We probably hit every island nation in the Pacific during World War II to dislodge those wacky Japanese. Yet, somehow, here we are binging anime and Extreme Elimination Challenge. On the other hand, the United States went into Central America so many times that there's a statue of the Chiquita Banana Woman on top of our Capitol Rotunda, making the world safe for the United Fruit Company. You remember I did an episode on the Spanish-American War when we went into Cuba and the Philippines to drive out the evil Spanish, and then we decided, well, we might as well stick around. That did not make us popular with the Filipinos. In fact, it led to a whole nother war. In terms of actual invasion, as in sending our military as opposed to the Dave Clark 5, the number for us may be more like 68 other countries, the most dangerous of which was undoubtedly Grenada, because we can't have commies running a medical school, now can we? There were also lots of humanitarian and peacekeeping missions. Some of those interact directly with the whole invasion part. Like, after us and the Brits turned Berlin into Barney Rubble for several years in the early 1940s, we organized the greatest airlift in world history to get food and supplies to the people there in order to keep it from going to the Soviets. The locals were extremely grateful. They were eating, for God's sake, but they also didn't suddenly purge their memories of who bombed them out of their apartments in the first place. Somalia was technically a humanitarian aid mission, but you saw Black Hawk Down, right? As bad as the warlord situation might have been, we were not universally beloved in Somalia. Before we get to more examples, how about some recent overall perspective? Let's look at the polls. First, what do Americans think other world leaders think about our president? In other words, how paranoid as a people are we about what other leaders are saying behind our backs? Since 2000, the one who we had the most confidence in was overwhelmingly Barack Obama. George W. had this little mini peak after 9/11, but then he dropped into oblivion. The only other president in the last 5 to top 50% in if we thought other leaders viewed him favorably was Joe Biden in his first year. The Orange Goon mostly stayed under 30% his entire term. Americans were pretty decent judges of how he was viewed by his fellow world leaders because, well, they saw other presidents and premiers at the summits even refuse to shake that despicable lion con man's hand. And all of that matters to our daily lives, even though the radical right might not think it does. Diplomacy is a big deal, and it impacts trade, and that rhymes with the cost of goods, and also French-made, and that starts with a capital T right here in River City. 76 trombones in the... When it comes down to it, though, other world leaders kind of have to deal with this. But what do the regular Joes think, or the regular Jose's or Osips? I turned to the Pew Research Center, which is greatly respected, nonpartisan, and founded by a lovable cartoon skunk. Pepe was nice enough to have compiled the actual polling of people in 23 major countries as to what their citizens thought of the United States. It should come as no surprise that the majority of the lowest ratings, the point where citizens of these other 23 countries had their worst opinions of the United States, came under the Orange Goon. 12 of the 23 bottomed out when Chito Benito was in the White House. 9 bottomed out under George W., and most of those were in 2003 and 2004 when we were killing 300,000 Iraqis for no fucking reason whatsoever. There were 2 under Obama. One of those is Israel, where we dropped down to a 71% favorability rating, which can hardly be called damning. I mean, shit, 10% of Americans don't like cheeseburgers, damn pinko commies. And there is one that happened under Biden. It is in Hungary, which is currently ruled by an openly fascist dictator who spews anti-American propaganda. So if the Hitler clones don't like you, personally, I count that as a win. By the way, Hungary is the only one of the 23 countries currently giving the United States a negative rating. That shit matters. An actual adult in the White House who cares about our allies matters. The world hated us under the Orange Goon, and that's not speculation. It is backed up with hard, factual numbers. Then there's the case of the British comedians, who had bits thanking the U.S. for electing Von Clownstick because it kept the UK, who had elected Boris Johnson, from being the stupidest damn country on the planet. And just like the Americans guessed, our highest point in favorability this century came under Obama. But for 6 countries, it is right now, under Joe Biden. Interestingly, Argentina, where I just came back from, jumped over a 50% favorability rating for the United States just this year for the first time since Bill Clinton left office. Now, I'm not saying my visit was responsible for that, but jump to your own conclusions. Argentina's opinion of the U.S. of A. fell all the way down to a 16% favorability in 2007. That meant 84% of the people there disliked us. And it was over U.S. foreign policy. Argentina was labeled the most anti-American country in the Western Hemisphere. And that's not even the worst. In Spain, in 2003, the U.S. scored only 14% favorability. That was backlash against the Iraq War. We only got 25% in Germany that year, 31% in France, and 34% in Italy, and those are supposed to be our closest friends. Where are we overall right now? The median score of those 23 countries going into 2024 is 59% favorable for the U.S. and 30% unfavorable. The other 11% were busy sniffing paint. Just a matter of trivia, who liked us the most in the last 25 years? Well, the U.S. got up to a 94% favorable rating in Kenya when Obama was president, since he famously had a Kenyan-born father. By the same token, our support among Neanderthals soared when Marjorie Taylor Greene got elected to Congress. I mentioned the Iraq War thing because we have never really recovered from it in some places. For both the UK and Germany, our highest ratings were pre-9/11 and pre-invading Iraq because they tried to kill my daddy. In 2004, my band played the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, Scotland. We lived there for 5 weeks, had our own flat. On the 5th floor, mind you, and don't believe those damn Brits who tell you the first floor is not the ground floor. That was 10 tall flights of stairs. Oh my God! We accidentally found an escalator at Marks & Spencer, and we rode that son of a bitch for 90 minutes straight. Anyway, one afternoon, we were having great beer and bad food at a pub, and this Scots dude just starts yelling at us about being Americans and how much we suck. He's got veins popping and everything, and I'd tell you his face was turning red, but those folks are always kind of naturally pink. We finally figure out he was mad about Bush and the Iraq War. And I explained to him that tens of millions of Americans, including me, had not voted for Bush. And then my fiddle player kicked him in the nads and stole his vinegar bottle. Crisis averted. But that was not the only anti-American incident we faced during those 5 weeks. The Brits really hated Americans during the Iraq War. If you still think specific American politics don't impact what everyday citizens in other countries think of us, let's look at Mexico. Prior to 2016, which if I recall was an election year, favorability ratings for the U.S. and Mexico were between 69 and 47% every year. But when the diapered chimp took office in 2017, those alleged rapists and drug dealers south of the border told pollsters a very different story. Those who liked us in Mexico fell from 66% in Obama's last year to 30% in the first year of the Dayglow dotard. Today, under Biden, our rating among Mexicans is back to 63%. That is a crazy 27% jump just because we elected Joe in 2020. France may be our oldest ally and all, but the French people hate everyone. They've added protest and snobbery as official sports in the Paris Olympics. Parisian waiters are world famous for not giving a rat's ass. By the way, I found the best way to combat that is find a table next to Germans. Honestly, I love France as much as any country I have ever been to. The French, like the Americans, are very proud, and if you at least make the effort to speak French, start every conversation with bonjour or bonsoir, throw in a liberal helping of merci madame, you'll be fine. You can even order white wine with sausage if it's the right white wine. But the French don't always like the Americans. So, how have these anti-American feelings in other countries manifested themselves in the past? Well, sometimes rather violently. We all remember when Reagan got our Marine barracks in Beirut blown up, and we know good and well that the U.S. consulate in Benghazi got attacked while Hillary was Secretary of State. There were 297 hearings on it when Republicans tried to make it her fault, for crying out loud. How could we forget? But most of these attacks on U.S. diplomatic facilities are organized, directly in operation of some terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, or those kids selling magazine subscriptions. Very few of these attacks are just spontaneous, unorganized anti-American hatred. You are much more likely to find that among radical right Americans attacking synagogues or black churches, and that is not a joke. There are exceptions. The first attack on an American embassy that I could find was in 1924 in Tehran, in what they then called the Sublime State of Persia, a place I first reached in the back of a '73 Pontiac. That was pretty much an angry mob led by members of Muslim clergy who were pissed off because they blamed Americans for poisoning a local well. They hauled the U.S. consul outside and beat him to death. Iran, of course, has a large history of attacking American embassies, and every time it was led by clergy. I seriously think those guys should just take a page from the Methodists and start eating potato salad. There was what may have been a spontaneous mob attack in Taiwan in 1957 after a U.S. Army sergeant confronted a Taiwanese Army major who allegedly was peeping through the bathroom window watching the sergeant's wife take a bath. The Sarge shot the Taiwanese guy, and a U.S. Army court-martial acquitted him. Rumors started going around that the two men were either involved in a love triangle or some black market scheme. Next thing you know, there's a mob of 6,000 people tearing up downtown Taipei and attacking the U.S. Embassy. Probably the most spontaneous for sure happened in 1959. That's the Panama riots, though nobody was killed. It was November 3rd, Independence Day, courtesy of the United States, and a crowd of several hundred people were celebrating, aka knee-walking drunk. And they decide that they don't like the fact that the Panamanian flag doesn't fly inside the Canal Zone, which is supposedly merely leased to the United States. So they break through a fence and attack U.S. soldiers with rocks. They get tear-gassed in return. The result is the U.S. builds a bigger wall, and Americans in the Canal Zone boycott stores in Panama. President Eisenhower started flying the Panamanian flag inside the Canal Zone, but there was another riot in 1964. Like everything else, how people in other countries view Americans is complicated and nuanced. More importantly, it depends on who you ask. In most countries, data tells you that the more conservative and wealthy you are, the more you like the United States. The single exception right this minute is the aforementioned Hungary, with the fascist dictator who has cracked down on the press, the judiciary, and the universities, and who is a role model and fellow traveler of the treasonous Orange Goon. And oh yeah, he's also the dictator who got his dictator panties in a dictator bunch when President Biden publicly called him a dictator. Accent on the dick. Anyway, Hungary is the current outlier, so enough about them. Let's look at Colombia as a good and rather random example. Plus, it's the context for those Panama riots. The biggest block of foreign tourists in Colombia are from the United States. Cruise ships are in and out of Cartagena all day long. Medellin, or Medellin, for pretentious bastards, once the drug capital of the world, is now a tourist spot, and I don't mean for moving cheap blowout by helicopter. We've had a relationship with Colombia since 1810. Possibly our biggest interaction with them was when Teddy Roosevelt sent warships and forced them to hand over the entire isthmus that became the country of Panama. I can guarantee you we were not very popular in Colombia in 1903. See, Colombia had been Gran Colombia when it won independence from Spain, and that included Venezuela and Ecuador as part of Gran Colombia, but it had been shrinking, so the Colombians were already a little tight in the shorts. In 1885, the Panamanians, who had joined Colombia voluntarily but felt like they were being ignored like your middle child, started a rebellion, and the United States, who wanted to build a canal across their land but was already using a railroad for most Atlantic Pacific travel, sent the North Atlantic Fleet down there to keep an eye on things. Well, the Navy of Chile sent their biggest ship, the Esmeralda, which was named after a character on Bewitched, and happened to be the world's first protected cruiser, meaning it had an armored deck and huge guns, and it had orders to do whatever it takes to prevent the U.S. from annexing Panama. We didn't. About 15 years later, Colombia had another civil war. This one was called the Guerra de los Mil Días, the Thousand Days War. It was the conservatives against the liberals, as always, but this drew in liberals from Venezuela, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, too. It wiped out well over 100,000 people, 3% of the total population of Colombia, including child soldiers. At the end of this, when the conservatives finally got the liberals to surrender, Teddy sent more Navy ships, and this time the U.S. sees to it that Panama gets their independence and are so grateful that they give the United States that strip of land across the middle of the country. Here you go, buy yourself something nice. In 1928, the local workers of the United Fruit Company in Colombia, who I keep talking about, and I don't think y'all believe me as to just how big and powerful that company was. I mean, think Shell and Exxon. Anyway, those workers go on strike to be treated and paid like humans. The fruit barons flat refuse to negotiate. They're backed by both the U.S. and Colombian governments, since this is the international banana trade, and it's big money. Big money. Spin that wheel, Vanna. The Colombian army is sent in to set things right, and they set up machine guns on the roofs of low buildings surrounding the town square of Ciénaga, where there are 1,500 banana workers and their families, wives and children, who are there because they've been told that the governor was going to come speak to them. There was a 5-minute warning, and then the Colombian soldiers opened fire. From there, the stories vary widely. Bodies thrown into the sea, buried in mass graves. The number of dead, well, you can get estimates from as low as 47 to as high as 2,000. Gabriel Garcia Marquez used that as the basis for 100 Years of Solitude, and he pegged a fictional 3,000. The Colombians killed their own, but lots of them blamed the Americans for instigating it. In 1948, the U.S. created the Organization of American States out of the Pan American Union. It started pushing all the other countries in the Americas to fall in line with U.S. policy in the Cold War, and that in turn spawned communist guerrillas in Colombia and elsewhere. And then Reagan and his war on drugs came about. His administration totally abandoned the medical treatment for addicts that had been policy under Carter and opted for killing drug dealers instead. They sent a bunch of money to Colombia and Peru to beef up their military and go into jungles and, hey, use these new machine guns and rocket launchers we just gave you. And you can see that same example, by the way, here in the States since 9/11, when police departments started wearing riot gear and getting tanks to play with. And it changed the beat cop from Officer Krupke and Andy Taylor to Rambo and the Terminator. Like any other place, the opinions in Colombia differ depending on people's own politics and worldview. Here is what a Colombian leftist had to say about his country's history with the U.S. Quote, "All these things remain in the Colombian mentality when it is about the United States of America. However, for the Colombian elite, U.S. is of course the main partner for exploitation of the natural resources. While the American multinationals, with its Western allies such as Canada and Europe, bring out the Colombian gold, fuel, wood, emeralds, diamonds, etc., the Colombian elite guarantees that the Colombian poor population, made of indigenous farmers and Afro-Colombians, remain at their place, through a very complicated network of violence through paramilitarism, terror of state, dead of social leaders, etc. In this sense, the perception of poor Colombians, more than 70% of them, on United States is easy to guess." End quote. But the Colombians, many of them at least, got over all the U.S. hijinks. Part of that is because we are so dominant in the Western Hemisphere, they couldn't avoid it. We kept doing all that humanitarian stuff, just like we go dig water wells in Central America, or provide disaster relief after hurricanes, or fight Ebola in West Africa. We, as a government, regularly supplied medical, dental, and veterinary care to Colombians. We do a lot of good. We dug those wells for clean water, and in return, we left a bunch of special ops soldiers to fight drug cartels. Hey, a little armed foreign presence never hurt anybody. What could possibly go wrong? There are about 2 million Colombian Americans living in the U.S. If you ask them, they will tell you that the majority of Colombians view the United States favorably, but none of them think the U.S. is perfect. I found a quote from a Colombian-born engineer who lives here in the States. He said that all his friends back home think he has it made by living here. He said, quote, "It is definitely the land of opportunity, where someone without a college degree can make a decent living, get a car, maybe a house. It's probably not as much like that as before, but a gardener here can achieve a lot, much, much more than in Colombia. The infrastructure, how things are so simple for the sake of achieving a commercial transaction." End quote. And I can back him up on that. Elsewhere in the Americas, economic transactions that we think are simple are a ginormous pain in the ass. Argentina right now likes U.S. dollars since it's a stable currency and theirs is not, but lots of places don't take credit cards. Thing is, ATMs are only located in banks, nowhere else. And even in Buenos Aires, a metro area more populous than Los Angeles, you sometimes have to walk 15-20 blocks to find a bank, meaning to find an ATM, and that is in a densely populated upper-middle-class city commercial center. Some Argentinians, very few, have PayPal accounts, but if they don't, transferring money can be next to impossible. So that's something else we totally take for granted, right up there with the biggies like free speech and heated car seats. Anyway, back to the engineer from Colombia talking about the U.S. Quote, "Now, some just don't like it. It's overly consumerism. For some, the food, the grandiose sense of entitlement of some. The thing is that the idea of the U.S. is what we tend to love or hate. I was personally in touch with American culture, so I knew what I loved and hated before moving over here. Some others, particularly those who have been affected by the war on drugs, can't help but feel like Colombians put the blood and the shame and feel the U.S. government tries to buy themselves out of the problem by throwing money to support the war on drugs when the reason of it is American consumption." End quote. The food thing, by the way, lots of countries around the world see Mickey D's and Coca-Cola and Starbucks as the lead representatives of our entire American culture. And though those companies and others like KFC and BK all make a shit ton of money and the locals scarf it right down, some other people really hate that Americanism, or even the concept of fast food that we export around the globe. Just like Vermont doesn't want the stench of Walmart within their borders, people in Lebanon might not relish their kids becoming fat asses. Relish. See what I did there? Even some of the bottled water brands are owned by Coke. And by the way, Sin Gas. If I wanted Schweppes, I'd ask for it, damn it. Burp. Some American fast food things just don't quite translate, by the way. There is a multi-location restaurant in Buenos Aires called, and I am not making this shit up, Kentucky Pizza. No. When Americans think of good pizza, that is not the spot. New York pizza. That's incredible pizza. Napoli, of course, is where it all started, but for the great pie in the U.S., you go to New York. New Haven, great pizza. Detroit, even that gooey casserole glop they make in Chicago and call pizza. But Kentucky, no. Just no. Now, if the pizza was topped with weed and squirrel meat, and if you ate the slice off your first cousin's bare midriff, then they might be onto something. Speaking of food, One night, we sat next to a New York business dude who was down there to cement a deal of some kind with his Argentinian counterparts. Him and 5 Argentinian men are having a parrilla. First of all, the dude was way out of his depth, like the chess club captain trying to match sports exploits with the college quarterback. Truth be told, this guy was probably more like chess club third string. During competition, he probably schlepped nosebleed packs to other chess players. "I'd like another tissue, forthwith." Anyway, this New York City guy starts apologizing for American cuisine. Now, excuse me, there are only 6 countries on Earth that have more than 200 Michelin-starred restaurants, and one of them is the United States. Another is France, where Michelin is based, and the other 3 are countries that border France, where Michelin is based. In terms of diversity of cuisine, no place comes close to the United States. Now, let me repeat that from good restaurants to little walk-up empanada places, every meal we had in Argentina was delicious. But dude, the U.S. has plenty to apologize for, but food is not one of them, provided you're not confining yourself to places with a drive-through. Anyway, back to our examination of other countries and how they feel about the United States. All of this foreign opinion is based on 2 things: their personal interaction with tourists and visitors, and our government. Not just in Colombia, but everywhere. And having the actions of the U.S. government be the basis for other people's opinions is pretty damn frightening. But does it really translate over to how foreigners act toward visiting U.S. tourists? Well, let me share a couple of personal examples. In 1991, my great pal Jimmy Pineapple and I went and performed in London. On the day we checked in, we had to wait in the hotel lobby for quite a while because we were early and we had to wait for him to make up our room. And I got into a long conversation with this very nice older man from India. Traditional Hindu clothing for him and his wife. At one point, he asked his wife in Hindi for something, and she produces this cloth pouch of cashew nuts. He shares them with me in this very ceremonial kind of vibe. Didn't see the guy for 2 weeks, but when we opened the door to our room to go check out and come home, this nice Hindu man was standing in front of our door. He acted like he was lost, but it was eerie and mystic. He shook my hand and wished me well and told me that I was a very good representative of my country. I have never forgotten that moment. It was really cool. Same trip. At the train station in Irún, Spain, we had some crazy old Salvador Dali-looking dude yelling at me and Jimmy because we were speaking English. Now, he was speaking Basque, so we had not a remote clue what he was mad about until I heard him use the word inglés. When I said, "No inglés, soy americano," he cut his wrists. Right there on the platform, bled out. So, I'm always curious to hear about other perspectives. Probably the most meaningful conversation I had about international affairs on this recent trip was in Puerto Iguazú, Argentina, with a street menu hawker. This is like one of those guys dressed up as the Statue of Liberty spinning signs during tax season, only he was trying to lure tourists into the restaurant that was paying him. He spoke almost no English beyond good food, low prices. And as mentioned, my Spanish is spotty, but we struggled through a conversation. He asked where I was from, and I said the U.S., and he said, "Oh, that's a nice place." But when he said, "Where in the U.S.?" and I said, "Texas," he said, "Oh, violent." I shook my head. I told him Chicago was violent, but even as I was saying it, I was wondering if I was lying. I mean, the Mexican border, Gaza, Ukraine, that's violent, right? While TripAdvisor is telling us watch out for pickpockets in Argentina, the locals there have a vastly worse picture of the United States. And the criminal stooges on the Supreme Court keep ignoring 100 years of precedents, not to mention common sense, to ensure we keep killing each other by the thousands, thus improving our international profile. I want to go back to something that engineer from Colombia had to say. The idea of the United States. He nails it. In practice, the United States is great. We were the first to really put into practice those Enlightenment ideas and create a representative government. Now, you all know full well it only represented a tiny fraction of the U.S. population, but we have gotten better at that stuff over the centuries. I think in a lot of ways, people from other countries see the promise of the American Democratic Republic better than we do. But those people also realize more clearly that the U.S. has largely fucked things up by making everything about money. Repeat after me, our open bribery and our political system is the root of all evil in this country. Okay, don't really repeat it because it totally screws up my timing. You know I can hear you, right? The point is that Americans really need to travel to other countries and observe, immerse themselves, even for a day. Whether we are now or ever have been the greatest country on earth, well, that's not even really a thing. It shouldn't be a competition. But if it was, I can promise you that our healthcare system is not even in the top 10. Neither are our public schools. Those are all eat up with suckage. So, a little less elitism would do us Americans a world of good. I want to end by talking about getting around in Buenos Aires, Argentina. You read all the TripAdvisor entries and they make a huge point of warning you about taxicabs there ripping you off. And I know all about that after traveling around Rome. Bite my ass, Italian cab drivers. In BA, though, most Uber drivers want to be paid in cash. So if you have a US-installed Uber app, it charges your card, and then the drivers expect greenbacks, which are actually yellowbacks there, but nonetheless. So we hailed cabs all over BA since we were there for a total of 10 days. And you know what? Those were the cheapest rides we got. We could cross the whole business district for $4 or $5. We had surly drivers who reminded you of Manhattan. We had one guy jamming out and singing along with Phil Collins. I'd have joined him, except it was 6 a.m. We had one 75 or 80-year-old cabbie pick us up one night. Very talkative dude who spoke zero English. And he told us the restaurant we just ate at was way too expensive. For the record, we spent about $110 on 2 great steaks, an appetizer, 2 sides, bread, bottled water, and a fantastic bottle of Malbec. But the dude says that good meat and good wine makes Argentina a beautiful country. He's right. It does. But you know what else does? For our airport trips, once we got there, we had a total of 3 of those. We used a company called Welcome Pickup. And we had the same driver, a guy named Pedro. Pedro liked practicing his English, so we talked about all kinds of things. The different immigrants to Argentina and the neighborhoods they lived in, how normal people lived there, soccer, polo, politics, drug cartels in other countries. And when he picked us up for our flight home, as we were stopped at a light about halfway to the airport, Pedro handed my wife a little bead bracelet that said Buenos Aires and had a couple of little red hearts on it. He had asked his daughter to make that for her and wanted us to always have fond memories of his city. We most definitely will. And I hope all my fellow Americans can both experience and share some of that kindness with people from elsewhere. We are all in this together. How's that for sappy? Okie dokie, I am back to work writing, but I need to plug my latest book, Undertold Texas. There are 48 chapters that are about as diverse a collection of history from a single state as you will ever find. Hopefully, you won't find a stereotype or hero myth in the entire book unless it was something I was skewering when I wrote it. Undertold Texas and all my other books are available via Amazon, which ironically we saw no evidence of in South America, or by order through your favorite local bookstore. You can also get signed copies on my website. My dogs have been practicing their autographs. Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my website at MikeVanceWriter.com. Prick the Balloon is copyrighted by Mike Vance, all rights reserved.